Welcome to our series on political crisis in Pakistan from the lens of the humanities. पाकिस्तान के सियासी बहरान पर हबीब यूनिवर्सिटी की सीरीज़ में आपका खैर मकदम है. I'm Noman Naqvi, an associate professor in the Department of Comparative Humanities here at Habib University in Karachi. The distinctive comparative humanities degree at Habib combines the fields of history, religion, literature, and philosophy, bringing together the most critical questions and perspectives of our time in one essential transdisciplinary humanities major. Last week, Saturday, on Habib University's Twitter space, we did a general program on the political crisis in Pakistan. A very successful program, I might add. Many thanks to the panelists, organizers, and the audience and participants. In that program, we charted the general lay of the land, as it were, some of the topical features of Pakistan's political crisis. Starting this Saturday, yani right now, this program, right now, we will be examining the crisis through the angles of religion, history, literature, and philosophy for 4 consecutive Saturdays. Our program today is titled Religion and Politics in Pakistan. शुरू में ही मैं ये कहता चलूँ गो के हबीब यूनिवर्सिटी ने ये प्लेटफॉर्म स्पॉन्सर किया है. जो कुछ इसमें कहा जाएगा उसके लिए हबीब यूनिवर्सिटी बज़ात खुद जाहिर है कि जिम्मेदार नहीं है. ये हम सब इस प्रोग्राम में बोलने वालों के अपने ख्याल और अपने ज़मीर पर ही है, चाहे हम हबीब यूनिवर्सिटी से वाबस्ता हों या ना हों. Habib University is in no way responsible for what is said in this session. That's up to our own thinking and conscience. ह्यूमैनिटीज़ एक जदीद इस्तिलाह है, चुनाचे इसका कोई बराह रास्त तर्जुमा राइज नहीं है, मगर इन उलूम को हम अदबियात, इंसानियात या बशरियात भी ये नाम दे सकते हैं. इन उलूम का इखलाकियात और चुनाचे सियासियात से गहरा ताल्लुक़ होता है. आज तो सियासत बहुत बदनाम नज़र आती है, मगर सियासत की बड़ी अहमियत भी है और दर्जा भी कि इखलाकियात की तरह इसका कुल इंसानी वजूद से ताल्लुक़ है, और यही सूरत हाल ह्यूमैनिटीज़, अदबियात और इंसानियात की भी है. इसका कुछ शायबा हमारे अल्फाज हुकूमत और हिकमत की मुमासलत में भी सुनाई देता है, यानी सियासत का मार्फत से एक ताल्लुक़ है. There is a relationship between governance and wisdom. As for today's program on religion contrary to expectations, indeed contrary to our concepts, we can see that there is an ineradicable relation between politics and religion across the world, whether it is the US, where over 80% of the evangelical churches support Trump, and the US Supreme Court is also religiously, quote-unquote, inclined, as seen in the recent reversal of Roe versus Wade, or indeed even in the most purportedly secular Republic of France, where rampant Islamophobia indicates a certain Christian prejudice, even if indirectly. In fact, by a famous quote of 18th century German political thinker Carl Schmitt, all modern political concepts are secularized theological concepts. यानी कि ये जो हम दुनियावी या सेक्युलर समझते हैं जदीद तसव्वुरात को, वो कहता है, और आज के दौर में मेरे ख्याल में ये ख़ास तौर पे वाज़े होना शुरू हो गया है, और भी वाज़े होना शुरू हो गया है कि वो दुनियावी तसव्वुरात जो हैं दरअसल दीनियाती या मजहबी तसव्वुरात हैं, जिनको एक दुनियावी शक्ल ज़ाहिर है, उससे उनका मतलब जो है वो बदल जाता है, मगर फिर भी उसका जो मजहबी एक ताल्लुक़ है, दीनियाती एक उसका पहलू है, वो फिर भी गो के छुपा ही हो या बातनी ही हो, फिर भी मौजूद रहता है. Indeed, the relationship between religion and politics is not simply given. The relationship between religion and politics is not simply given or not given, but changes and takes on different forms. We have seen, for instance, this relationship and the nature of religion transform dramatically, in front of our eyes virtually, in the polity of India over the past 8 years and more. In the case of Pakistan, the relationship between religion and politics appears to be simply given, even notoriously so. But even here, the relationship changes and continues to change. So the relationship between religion and politics under General Ayub, for example, was not the same even as it was under General Zia. It is only like virtually every other national tradition that the question of religious and national identity are deeply intertwined in Pakistan. और ये हमको ख्याल रखना चाहिए, क्योंकि इस लिहाज से, और मेरे ख्याल में इसमें भी वो कुछ इस्लामोफोबी सिलसिला है और दूसरी भी वजूहात हैं. ये समझा जाता है कि पाकिस्तान कोई ख़ास तौर पे बदनाम है इस सिलसिले में, मगर ये रिश्ता गौर करें और महज कौमी फ्रेमवर्क से, नेशनल फ्रेमवर्क से निकल के देखें तो आपको पूरी दुनिया में किसी ना किसी शक्ल में ये रिश्ता नज़र आएगा. बहरहाल, in today's program, we will examine the status of this relationship in the present, here in the context of Pakistan, panelists will analyze the specific ways in which religion and politics come into relation in Pakistan historically and at the current moment, and perhaps also how might there be a more healthy relation between the two. I want to thank our panelists today, especially, and my colleague will just introduce them. I also want to, before I hand over the mic to him, I want to thank Marcom, Marketing and Communications at Habib University. First of all, Aksa Junaido Saiba, who actually thought of doing this series. So the initiative came from her. So I'm grateful to her for creating this opportunity for these conversations. And also, especially, although I thank the entire Marcom team, they've all worked very hard and are working very hard to make this possible. I also want to thank Rida Rashid, who has really worked very, very hard and constantly with both myself and the other panelists in each of the programs in the series. Now it is my pleasant honor to introduce my colleague from the Department of Comparative Humanities, Mr. Basharat Isa, who works in the field of religious studies and anthropology, and he'll be introducing our panelists for today. Thank you for coming to this program. I see there's a large number of people present. Thank you so much to you. Basharat.
Bahut shukriya, Noman Saab. Thank you very much. I welcome everyone to this space. Thank you for joining us. Before I introduce the speakers, I would like to briefly share a few thoughts. It's an honor for me to share this space with such a highly learned and scholarly panel as a moderator. For me, as someone who comes from one of the peripheries of Pakistan and is a beginner in my academic interest in such topics, there are more questions and confusions about religion and politics in Pakistan, which I look forward to get some answers and ideas from this space. These questions basically originate from the study and realization of a distinct and marginalized identity in Pakistan, to which both religion and politics are the basic contributors. And this is how I see religion and politics in Pakistan concern us, not only as individuals, but as communities and various other identities that we are associated with. At this point, this recent video from Kailash Valley comes to my mind, where supporters of a certain political party in Pakistan were chanting political slogans at a religious festival of the indigenous Kailash community. And this video makes me think about various aspects of the relationship of religion and politics, of which one is that how using a dominant narrative of religion and politics is basically a discrimination and marginalization of such indigenous and other minority communities. So generally, when it comes to religion and politics in Pakistan, it's such a huge topic that one wonders where to begin with, especially based on the history or even religious studies that's taught in Pakistan. From the arrival of Muhammad bin Qasim to the Mughal and other Muslim empires and sultanates in the subcontinent to the idea of Pakistan and everything that has been happening in Pakistan for the last 7 decades, of which some Noman Naqvi Saab mentioned. Uh, and the ongoing idea of the state of Pakistan and much more are basically all part of this discussion. So on the one hand, we have these critical and highly academic approaches to the understanding of religion, even questioning the term religion, which I believe we now use for actions, ideas, and practices existed even before the term religion was there. And these discussions are generally considered to be limited to the ivory towers or maybe conferences in universities or books to which a certain class has the access. And on the other hand, there is this living expression of the religion, which has been there for centuries, and this mostly involves the general masses. So the question arises that are the two situations relevant? And if they are, how and why, and then how this scholarly or academic discussion concerns or contributes to the masses, especially when we are talking about a healthy relationship of religion and politics, because we clearly see that there is a clear divide and discrimination and even violence based on the understanding and the practice of both religion and politics. Even the question that are the two categories separate or independent of each other is equally important. And then also when we talk about religion in Pakistan, I believe it naturally equates to Islam. So generally when it's referred to religion in Pakistan, it is Islam unless we talk about some soft image or diversity. Then sometimes it's about other religions. So I believe in the context of Pakistan, Islam and politics might be the accurate topic compared to religion and politics. And I think this is not just theology that should be always integral to the discussion on religion, but it's very important to look into other aspects of religion. And we hope that this discussion today would definitely look into these other aspects. So there's a lot to say, but as a moderator, I have to stop here. And already many people have joined us. So I would like to briefly introduce our speakers for the discussion. And I'm not sure if Rida has been able to get Zahid and Naseem Zahra Saiba as speakers yet. Okay. So for our panel today, we have Naseem Zahra Saiba. Naseem Zahra is a senior Pakistani journalist and writer who hosts a primetime current affairs talk show on Channel 24. Her book, From Kargil to Coup, Events That Shook Pakistan, it came out in 2018. And then we have Zahid Hussain Saab. Zahid Hussain Saab is a senior Pakistani journalist, author, and a television analyst. He has been a visiting fellow at Wolfson College, University of Cambridge, and at the Stimson Center in DC. Frontline Pakistan, The Struggle with Militant Islam is one of his books. And we have Dr. Faisal Devji. Dr. Faisal Devji is a historian currently based in the Oxford University as a professor of Indian history and director of the South Asian Studies Center. Dr. Devji is interested in political thought in addition to ethics, in Indian political thought in addition to ethics and violence in a globalized world. And you might know Muslim Zion, Pakistan, and as a political idea is one of his books. And then finally, we have Dr. Aslan Khan. Dr. Aslan Khan is an assistant professor of anthropology at the Union College, US. His research focuses on ritual, gender, and ethics, themes that he explores in the context of the Islamic revival in Pakistan. So we welcome our distinguished panelists, and I'm not sure if we have Zahid Hussain and Naseem Zahra Saib as speakers. So we'll go to Dr. Faisal Devji first for the opening comments. Over to you, Dr. Faisal Devji.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you today. I just thought I'd say a few words to initiate this conversation about what I believe is the curious and interesting coincidence between the rise of Imran Khan as a political actor in Pakistan, his rise to the prime ministership, and the simultaneous rise of Barelvi mobilization in the country. This rise is in part mediated by the current Mrs. Imran Khan, who, as you all know, is a religious authority in her own right, and the gender dimension of her mediation between her husband's political career and aspirations and its link with Barelvi mobilization in Pakistan is something certainly worth considering. What I see as having happened in the last number of years in Pakistan is a massive and an important shift between the Deobandi dominated mobilizations in Pakistan's public space, which had until recently carried the day for many decades in Pakistani politics, and the shift towards a Barelvi dominated public space in terms of protests, demonstrations, and mobilizations. Now, the Barelvi mobilization has in some ways modeled on its Deobandi precedent and rivals, but it is different in a number of ways as well, partly because it has to do no longer with attempts to capture the state and remake it so much as to voice the apparent aspirations of people, indeed the people, and society. So it seems to me that whatever its political interactions, claims, and demands, the Barelvi-led mobilization represented by the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan speaks strongly from the field of the social. It claims to represent the social or society, and rather than making governmental type demands that have to do with changing institutional structures, it really is dedicated to mobilizing in the name of devotion to the Prophet. And this is a major difference. And I would like to close this very brief set of reflections by speculating how they actually relate very closely to what's going on across the border in India. There, too, you have the emergence of Hindutva as a social phenomenon, on the one hand, that does not necessarily seek to remake the state, but to represent the people. So in that sense, it's a different form of political religion we're talking about altogether. And you can see this in Imran Khan's rise, fact that he had two distinct and not always overlapping constituencies. One, of course, are the group of educated youth who were drawn to his movement, to his movement's focus on anti-corruption, very much like what had happened in India with the Aam Aadmi Party. And on the other hand, you have the Barelvi-dominated religious element, um, which was in full evidence in his election campaign when he became prime minister, in the visits to Sufi shrines and all the kinds of things he was doing at that time. So the the two bases or the two audiences that Imran Khan's politics commands, I think, bears some attention, because it seems to suggest to me what I have hinted at just now, that religion, at least this sort of religion in Pakistani politics, is no longer of the Deobandi variety, or indeed of the kind represented by the Jamaat-e-Islami, which had been devoted to remaking the state itself, in part out of fear for the people, out of fear of the people and the going wrong of the people. So let me stop there.
Excellent. Actually, I want to acknowledge the fact that in his usual manner, Professor Devji has pointed to a critical shift that is taking place in our historical moment. So that's very exciting, and there are many questions that arise from that. One that immediately occurs to me is just like the Deoband were transformed in various ways in their historical entanglements. The nature of the tradition itself changed. So even the difference between Deoband in India and Deoband in Pakistan, what is that doing to the Barelvi? What is this new development that you're talking about? What is it doing to the Barelvi tradition itself? But before we get to the questions, I'd like my colleague Basharat to introduce the next speaker. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Noman Saab. So we already have Zahid Hussain Saab and Naseem Zehra as speakers. We welcome Zahid Hussain Saab and Naseem Zehra Sahiba as speakers to this panel. So if Naseem Zehra Sahiba can hear us, so I'll go to Naseem Zehra Sahiba for her opening comments on this topic. I think Naseem Zehra Sahiba को हमारी आवाज नहीं जा रही.
जी Naseem Zehra Sahiba, can you hear us? So for the audience or the participants, you have to realize the medium that's new to all of us. So please bear with, our getting the hang of this medium. Hopefully, we'll be able to be the program can be tighter as it moves forward from Saturday to Saturday. Naseem Zehra Sahiba, can you hear us?
I think we can go to Zahid Hussain Saab until.
I think that's a good idea.
Ji, over to you, Zahid Saab, for your opening remarks, please. Zahid Hussain Saab, आपको हमारी आवाज आ रही है?
Can you hear me now? Hello.
Ji, Zahid Saab, we can hear you now. Please,
okay.
Over to you.
Thank you, Noman, and thank you, Habib University, for inviting me for this discussion. I think actually when we are talking about religion and politics in Pakistan, from the very beginning, we have seen religion as playing a very important role in politics. In fact, actually, when Pakistan was created, it was supposed to be a kind of a modern state for Muslims of South Asia. But later on, we have seen actually throughout 1950s and earlier days, the religion became a part of the politics. And I think major change came in the whole concept of Pakistan was that when this objective resolution was passed by the Assembly in Pakistan way back in 1951, and that was supposed to determine the Pakistani state as a Muslim identity and Islamic identity. And that actually is the beginning of what we could see, the changing complexion of state of Pakistan. And later on, actually, we have seen every political party, whether they are irrespective, whether they are religious parties, are supposed to be more moderate Muslim parties or political parties all use religion for their political purposes. And in fact, actually, we have seen actually major change under military government of General Yahya Khan. That government was there for about 2 years, but it basically, for the first time in Pakistan history, we heard that main what they call actually the meaning of Pakistan, that's La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, and that was never heard before. So that basically the military government tries to actually further heighten the so-called Islamic identity of Pakistani state. Then I think probably after even when Mr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was supposed to be a secular leader, when actually he introduced this bill, which actually also, declared Ahmadis as non-Muslim. So that was the beginning of what we could see, the state's involvement in determining who's good Muslim or who's bad Muslim. And I think probably that was the beginning of what we could say, or allowed the other Islamic parties to our greater space to the Islamic Party, and then all debate started. And this is also a time when we saw the rise of sectarian group. So in fact, actually, that sharpened the sectarian conflict in Pakistan. And then actually, what the other major change came during General Ziaullah, which basically tried to give Pakistan a kind of theoretical, change the whole concept of Pakistan and to turn it into Islamic state. And that was also actually, he was aided by the international environment at that point of time. And I think probably that also gave rise to what we now actually known as Islamic militancy in Pakistan. And that was actually when Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and jihad became the main policy of state. And that was the period when we saw rise of Deobandi militancy. In the beginning, Deobandi has a very different outlook and about jihad and militancy. But 1980s and the so-called in Afghanistan changed the whole complexion of Deobandi Islam. And that's what actually we saw the rise of militant Islam also. And Deobandi Islam at that point of time, because it suited the military government, and also actually the Pakistan becoming a part of this war against communism. So basically, that was the period when we saw many militant organizations rose from the ranks of Deobandi parties, particularly JUI, and all the militant groups which we saw. We basically have some kind of links with Deobandi, except for one party, which is Lashkar-e-Taiba, which was directly influenced by Saudi Arabia or Wahhabi Islam. So I think probably that one could say that 1980s brought a new turn, or basically was a new turning point in Pakistan's politics of religiosity and militancy, and that continued after 1990s. And so it is not like actually that only religious parties were involved in politics of religion, but other parties too. So, but in 1990s, we also saw Nawaz Sharif, who was basically a protege of Ziaul Haq, but then he became prime minister. He tried to change his score, but still, actually, in his first government, he passed that bill, which is called Sharia bill, and that imposed actually so-called Sharia system, or tried to impose a Sharia system in Pakistan. So that was also a time saw that this kind of parties, every political party, has used this for political purposes and for electoral purposes. But in this course of time, we also saw the diminishing power of the traditional Islamic parties like Jamaat Islami and even JUI, politically speaking. And and then we saw the other change which came after Pakistan's involvement or in a new war in Afghanistan and a lie of the United States after 9/11. So 9/11 also brought a different kind of militant organization which were once part of the Pakistani state to fight its as a part of its regional and foreign policy objective. They turned against Pakistan government. and that we saw a different rise of militancy, which threatened Pakistan state itself. And and again, actually, when we talk about initially, Deobandi Islam was patronized by the state, but later on, we also saw it's a very recent phenomena, the rise of Barelvi militancy. In fact, actually, Barelvi until very recently, until a few years ago, was seen as a more moderate sect of Islam, and compared to Deobandis or compared to Wahhabi Islam. But now we have seen the new assertion of of Barelvi Islam, and the rise of TLP is one of these phenomena. And in fact, actually, what we have seen in the recent year is that TLP has become much more militant faction than any other religious party. In fact, it's also a great change when TLP has taken a space which is basically left by the decline of support base of traditional Islamic party like Jamaat Islami and JUI, particularly in Punjab area. So I'll stop here. So and let's whatever question you can ask.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Zahid, for that really comprehensive in so brief a period, really comprehensive overview of the career. And that's, I think, one of the major things that this program we'd like to emphasize is that, in fact, there is a history and a trajectory in the relationship between religion and politics. That is, the relationship between religion and politics is not simply given or not given. It is, in fact, the word evolving seems to have a teleological or a purpose-oriented ring to it, but certainly development or an evolution of the relationship and of the nature of religion and politics, each of them simultaneously. And I think when we come back to the various participants, we can elaborate, although Zahid has already indicated some of those, as has Professor Pesudevji, but elaborate more on that. But for now, I'd like, unfortunately, Naseem Zehra Saiba, we are not able to, even though she was present, we have not been able to make her audible. This is part of the problem with this new medium of Twitter space. Unlike Zoom, for instance, you can't fix everything beforehand, because the speakers can only get the links once the space opens. And once the space opens, then you just have to fix whatever problems there are during the program itself. So I hope she will be able to. I hope she will be able to speak. I can't see her at all now. But before that, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Arsalan Khan, who teaches anthropology at Union College and has written excellent, really, what should one say, seminal articles. And we all look forward to his book on the Tablighi Jamaat, which will be coming out soon. Maybe he can tell us a little bit about that later in the program. But I hand over the floor to you, Arsalan.
Thank you, Noman. Thank you, Basharat, for inviting me to this very important conversation. मैं चाहूँगा कि मतलब ये जाहिद साहब की कुछ बातों पे थोड़ी सी इन बातों को आगे बढ़ाऊँ. उन्होंने मतलब he's given us a good history. I want to talk about the relationship between Islam and state sovereignty in Pakistan. तो मतलब पाकिस्तान में मतलब दो competing narratives हैं. एक तो जिसको हम liberal secular narrative, कायदे आज़म का जो एड्रेस था Constituent Assembly को 11 अगस्त 1947 में, जिसमें उन्होंने कहा you are free to go to your temples, you are free to go to your mosque or to any other place of worship in the state of Pakistan, so on, right? Religion has nothing to do with the business of state. तो ये एक तरफ एक narrative है. दूसरी तरफ वो लोग हैं जो कहते हैं कि क्योंकि पाकिस्तान एक मुसलमान मुल्क है तो इस्लाम पाकिस्तान की रियासती खुद मुख्तारी की बुनियाद है, मतलब उसकी सॉवरेंटी की बुनियाद जो है वो इस्लाम है. और इसमें भी अगर आप देखें तारीख को तो इसमें भी कुछ सच्चाई है. हिस्टोरियन डेविड गिलमार्टिन ने अपने काम में बताया है कि मतलब 1946 के पंजाब में प्रोविंशियल इलेक्शंस में मुस्लिम लीग ने पाकिस्तान को एक आज़ाद इस्लामी रियासत के तौर पे पेश किया. गिलमार्टिन बताते हैं कि मुसलमानों का कि एक तरफ मुसलमानों को डर था कि हिंदू डोमिनेटेड इंडिया में मुस्लिम्स वुड नॉट बी एबल टू लिव फ्रीली, राइट. दूसरी तरफ उनको डर था ये था कि जो अंदरूनी जो मुसलमानों के अंदर पॉलिटिक्स है, तनाज़े हैं, और बरादरी और ज़बान के जो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स हैं, उन टेंशन्स की वजह से जब कॉलोनियलिज्म खत्म हो जाएगा, तो वो सब जो है वो सामने आ जाएंगे और एक इंतशार और फितने की सूरत हाल पैदा हो जाएगी। और उसको रोकने के लिए जो है वो हमें एक इस्लामी रियासत की जरूरत है। तो वो गिलमार्टिन जो है वो इसको एनालाइज करते हैं इनके बेसिकली इलेक्शन मटेरियल्स को। तो यानी कहने का मतलब ये है कि पाकिस्तान जो मुस्लिम लीग है डिड प्रेजेंट इटसेल्फ एज अ काइंड ऑफ कीपर ऑफ दीज ट्रांसेंडेंटल प्रिंसिपल्स ऑफ इस्लाम and the idea that you could hold together Muslims across kinship, ethnicity, and linguistic lines on the basis of an Islamic state. ठीक है, अब ये जैसे जाहिद साहब ने कहा था कि 1949 में जो ऑब्जेक्टिव रेजोल्यूशन है उसमें ये बिल्कुल ये बात जो है ये वाज़ेह हो जाती है, सामने आ जाती है, that the objective resolution reads, sovereignty belongs to Allah alone, but He has delegated it to the state of Pakistan through its people for being exercised within the limits prescribed by Him as a sacred trust. यानी आप इसको गौर से देखें तो पाकिस्तानी सॉवरेंटी में दो उसूल हैं, सही है। इन दोनों उसूल में एक बुनियादी तनाव या तजाद भी कह सकते हैं। एक तरफ अल्लाह की सॉवरेंटी है और सवाल उसमें यह आता है कि अल्लाह की सॉवरेंटी को कायम कैसे किया जाए दुनिया में, और दूसरी तरफ अवाम का विल है जिसको हम पॉपुलर सॉवरेंटी कहते हैं, जो कि दुनिया डेमोक्रेसी की बुनियाद होती है, राइट। और अगर हम तारीख देखें तो जाहिर होता है कि जो भी इक़्तिदार में आया है या जिसने भी आने की कोशिश की है, इन दोनों उसूलों को किसी भी पॉलिटिकल कुव्वत को सामने रखनी पड़ती है, राइट। पॉलिटिक्स में हर किसी को क्लेम करना पड़ता है कि वी आर both representatives of Allah's will on earth and the representatives of the awam, right? This is like the basic tension. उस टेंशन के अंदर एक और टेंशन नेस्टेड है पाकिस्तान के अंदर, वो है बिटवीन सेंट्रलाइजेशन एंड फ्रैगमेंटेशन ऑफ पावर। पाकिस्तान की तारीख में इस्लामिक सॉवरेंटी काफी हद तक एक सेंट्रलाइजिंग कुव्वत रही है। यानी अगर आप जियाउल हक के इस्लामाइजेशन को देखें तो उसका मकसद था कि पावर को अपने हाथ में सेंट्रलाइज करना, राइट। और किस बेसिस पे? उस बेसिस पे कि हम एक कौम है, एक हमारा नजरिया है, और जो इस्लाम पे कायम है, और बगैर इस्लाम के और बगैर कौमी नजरिए के हम कहीं के नहीं रहेंगे, बल्कि यहाँ सिर्फ इंतशार और फितना फैलेगा और फिर जैसे 71 में हुआ वैसे ही दोबारा होगा। तो और ये बात जो थी वो बिल्कुल जिया की बातों में मतलब साफ थी। जिया ने एक दफा 4 साल आई थिंक आफ्टर कमिंग टू पावर ही रोट, पाकिस्तान इज लाइक इजराइल एन आइडियोलॉजिकल स्टेट, take out Judaism from Israel and it will collapse like a house of cards. Take Islam out of Pakistan and make it a secular state, it will collapse. So Islam as a basis of unity, of transcendence, of differences. इस बात पे आई थिंक गौर करना पड़ेगा कि इस्लाम का जो सॉवरेंटी है ना, उसकी इट्स बिन सेट अप अगेंस्ट इन अ सेंस समथिंग एल्स, राइट। तो और एक खतरा रहता है, मतलब एक सेंस एहसास है कि एक खतरा है यहाँ पे। और ये किस चीज का खतरा है? ये उन सियासी कुव्वतों से है जो फेडरलिज्म और डिसेंट्रलाइजेशन डिमांड कर रहे हैं और जो अपने डेमोक्रेटिक हुकूक मांग रहे हैं, खास तौर पे एथनिसिटी और जबान की बुनियाद पे जो सियासत कर रहे हैं ना, ये पाकिस्तान के अंदर एक जनरली, जैसे कि we saw earlier in history, you see this again, that these forces are seen as a source of a kind of tension, a kind of fitna, a fragmentation. तो जो centralizing कुव्वत है पाकिस्तान में, उसने अपने आप को एक ट्रांसेंडेंट पावर के तौर पे जरा पेश किया हुआ है। और और मतलब प्रेजेंट इस्लामिक पॉलिटिक्स में ये है कि इस्लाम के बगैर जो है ये सब कॉन्फ्लिक्ट और ये टेंशन आ जाती हैं और sort of fragmentation आ जाता है। तो अब मैं आगे भी कुछ कहना चाहूंगा लाइक सेक्टेरियनिज्म के बारे में, जिस तरह जाहिद ने बात की है। जाहिर है इसमें कोई शक नहीं है कि इस सेंट्रलाइजिंग प्रोजेक्ट से फिरका वारियत और अज़बियत फैली है, और वो सब हम देख सकते हैं कैसे फैली है। तो इस पे आई थिंक I'll stop here for now. I want to talk about later, hopefully I'll have a chance to talk about the sort of threats, right? The claim to sovereignty of the state, this centralizing power of the state, and the type of threats that we see to it coming either from the TTP or from what I would call the TLP's more Brailwi but populist religiosity. These are the two types of threats. One that claims that the TTP, Taliban, which claims that they have an alternative sovereignty to the Pakistani state, and the other, which is a type of populist religiosity, which basically says that the Pakistani state is not living up to its claim, and it generates a kind of affective politics that demands that the Pakistani state live up to the claims of its sovereignty. So, I'll stop here. We can ask questions later and then maybe talk about these things. Thank you, Noman.
Okay, thank you so much, Arslan. What a fantastic analysis. There's so much there to think about and unpack. But before we return to the speakers, or before I say anything further, I'd like to get some questions from the audience, the participants who are here. So, Rida, can you facilitate that, please? So anybody who wants to speak, can you please raise your hand, and then Rida will successively hand over the mic to different people.
Yes, I am putting Mr. Arif on. Mr. Arif, can you please ask your question today, right now?
जी आरिफ साहब आप स्पीकर पे आ गए हैं तो आप सवाल पूछ सकते
हैं। मेरी किस्मत, थैंक यू सो मच। अस्सलाम वालेकुम, थैंक यू सो मच नुमान, Zahid साहब, pleasure and a privilege to hear from you. And the last speaker, पहली दफ़ा सलाम आपको सुन रहा हूँ, that's lovely synopsis. सवाल से मेरा ये है कि I think Zahid Saab and Arslan have laid out a very clear picture of the root causes of the problems. What I'd like you guys to expand on is the role of political Islam as defined by Maulana Maududi and its role in the state administration, and the role of Saudi Wahhabi money.
Okay, unfortunately, we're having the same again. Arif Saab, we can't hear you. So your voice is breaking up to the point that it's difficult to make out what you're saying.
Is it okay now?
It's better now, yes.
Okay, sorry about that. So as I was saying, the questions that I have, one is with regards to Maulana Maududi's political Islam ideology, which the state incorporated in its apparatus in many ways, especially after General Zia took over, and the role of Saudi Wahhabi money, not just Pakistan, but internationally, particularly post 1979, when they became active participant in Afghanistan. One of the premises that they required to be a partner was that they...
Okay, well, there we go again, Arif Saab, we can't hear you again. We just heard Saudi Wahhabi money, and that was that was the end of that.
I don't know if any speakers have heard him, Arslan, you or any other. आप लोग जवाब दे सकते हैं.
Yes, I've heard him. I heard parts of it.
Gee, so actually anybody can. I mean, yes, obviously this is another element in the mix that Arif Saab has brought up. Arslan, yes, you said you wanted to respond.
Sure, I can respond to this a little bit. I think that, yes, Pakistan has adopted a kind of vision. The Pakistani state sovereignty is definitely built on the vision of a kind of notion of an Islamic state that can be traced back to Maududi. I think that, in the early years of Pakistan, this was a kind of modernizing project. And from the 70s onwards, hum keh sakte hain ki, it opened up to many forces, including the ulama, and the sort of the incorporation of these complex contested forces that are all competing for defining what the state is exactly, what its features are. तो जाहिद साहब ने जो बात की थी वो बहुत अहम आई थिंक बात है, उस पर मैं एक सिर्फ ये कहना चाहूंगा कि देखें, जब रियासत को इस्लाम से जोड़ दिया जाता है तो फिर इस्लाम की भी एक डेफिनेशन बनानी पड़ती है, राइट, कि इस्लाम क्या है और मुसलमान क्या है. अब हर नेशन के अंदर तो ये जाहिर है, ये होता है कि नेशन के अंदर कौन है कौन नहीं है. तो अब इस्लाम को डिफाइन करने के लिए, अब स्टेट का प्रोजेक्ट है कि इस्लाम को डिफाइन करने के लिए, राइट, ये बड़ा मतलब मुश्किल पेचीदा सा सवाल है कि मतलब मुसलमान क्या है, कौन है, मतलब क्या फीचर्स हैं उसके, सही है. तो उसमें ये आ जाती है कहानी, जो मतलब अहमदी एक्सक्लूजन की जो हम बात करते हैं, अहमदी एक्सक्लूजन, राइट, दिस वाज द प्रॉब्लम ऑफ डिफाइनिंग इस्लाम फॉर द स्टेट, राइट. अगर रियासत की सॉवरेंटी की बुनियाद इस्लाम है तो इस्लाम के पैरामीटर्स, उसके हुदूद क्या हैं, दिस इज द काइंड ऑफ क्वेश्चन दैट केम अप. And we saw this as soon as Pakistan is founded in 50, and the Jamaat-e-Islami, of course Maududi's party, right, is pushing for a kind of ban and the exclusion के मतलब अहमदियों को जो इस्लाम से स्टेट रियासत जो है वो खारिज करे, उनको डिफाइन करे उसकी बाउंड्रीज को. So I think that you see this In 74, in the Munir Kyani report that looked at the 1953 riots, there was a lack of consensus on the definition of a Muslim. And so there's been this sort of effort to define Islam by virtue basically of what it's not. सही है ना, मतलब इस्लाम को डिफाइन करना तो बहुत मुश्किल है, तो इस्लाम को आप इस तरह डिफाइन करते हैं कि आप उसके एक्सटर्नल को, आउटसाइड को डिफाइन करें कि what it is not. And so Ahmadis have served that kind of purpose of drawing the boundaries around Islam. अब 1984 में जो शरीयत कोर्ट की रूलिंग है जो कहती है कि Ahmadis cannot be Muslim or quote indirectly or directly pose as Muslims, तो वो नवीदा खान है, एंथ्रोपोलॉजिस्ट नवीदा खान बताती हैं हमें कि ये बेसिस इसकी तो खैर मतलब एक तरह से उन्होंने इस रूलिंग में they drew, she says, on copyright laws, मतलब copyright laws that says that Islam is a type of property of a certain type of people. And she says, Nabila Khan argues in that right, this idea was that non-Muslims, in this case Ahmadis, posing as Muslims would be like defiling of a superior brand with an inferior one. यानी मतलब branding की logic or copyright की logic को incorporate किया जा रहा है to help to define and demarcate these kind of boundaries. So I think that you can see in this project of the linking of Islam with the state that this requires then a kind of definition of Islam, and it's been a very, it's been the project of, I think, Islamic forces, Islamic movements to define that, and mostly they have done it by defining its outside, its external, कि कौन नहीं है मुसलमान by virtue of that, and that's, I think, a बुनियाद, एक मतलब जो Islamic politics की एक बुनियाद है वो. So I'll pause there.
Right. Thank you, Arsalan. Yes, lots of very relevant pointed remarks in there. आपने ब्रांड का जिक्र किया तो मुझे एकदम मेरे जहन में ये रविंदर कौर की नई किताब ब्रांड न्यू नेशन भी मेरे दिमाग से एकदम गुजरी, कैपिटलिस्ट ड्रीम्स एंड नेशनलिस्ट डिजाइन्स अबाउट इंडिया. तो ये ब्रांडिंग का जो है वो नेशन स्टेट और नेशनलिज्म के साथ ख़ास तौर पे हमारे दौर में ये सिलसिला और भी बढ़ गया है. मगर मैं ये भी पूछना चाह रहा था क्योंकि आरिफ साहब बिफोर ही वाज कट ऑफ बाय ट्विटर और लॉस्ट हिज इंटरनेट कनेक्शन also because we have been mostly looking at the internal logics of the relationship between religion and politics in Pakistan. So he also brought up the Saudi Wahhabi connection, which has played obviously such an important role, and not just obviously the United States itself is in a different time period. So there is also this global dimension to the evolving trajectory. By the way, I want to say, I'm really sorry that Naseem Zahra Sahiba is not able to speak. She's having some problems hooking up with this new space. Right now, I think we should also, because part of the reason for doing this on Twitter Space is to get as many people involved in the conversation, I'd like to take a couple of more questions. So, Rida, if you could facilitate. So, thanks again, Arsalan, for your remarks. And Rida, can we get another couple of questions from the audience? Rida, we can't hear you. Yeah, I'm really sorry. We're having a difficult time today. Last week, it was all smooth sailing. And this week, we are having continuous problems for some reason. For which
I guess Nawaz Sahab, Waheed has the question if I'm right. Waheed Sahab?
जी मेरा जी क्विक क्वेश्चन है. वैसे तो पैनल में से कोई भी अगर आंसर करना चाहे, लेकिन मैं स्पेसिफिकली एड्रेस कर रहा हूँ अरसलान साहब को कि जो हमारा एग्जिस्टिंग 1973 का कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन है, इसको आप अगर सोसाइटी को देख रहे हैं पाकिस्तान की, तो क्या आप ये समझते हैं कि ये उन वैल्यूज उन एस्पिरेशंस को रिफ्लेक्ट करता है जो सोसाइटी में प्रिवेल कर रही हैं? सेकेंड पार्ट ऑफ द क्वेश्चन इज के आजकल ये डिबेट चल रही है कि वी नीड न्यू कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन. तो अगर एक नया कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन बनाया जाए आज के दौर में, तो आप पाकिस्तानी मौजूदा मुआशरे को देखते हुए क्या महसूस करते हैं? इज इट गोइंग टू बी मोर रिलीजियस और मोर लिबरल और सेक्युलर? थैंक यू.
Thank you, Waheed Sahab. Arslan, were you able to get this question?
Yes, I was able to. I mean, I don't have a full answer for that. I think that there are many competing forces in Pakistan. There are forces that are demanding institutional rights and decentralization and democracy, and then we have, like I said, these populist religious forces like TLP and जो Faisal Devji साहब ने पहले बात की थी, we're seeing shifts in these different types of politics. So I don't think there's any resolution. I mean, there's any definite what the future will look like. I would, from my perspective, I think that the deeper become Pakistan's social, political, and economic crises, the more likely we are to find ourselves in facing with the kinds of forms of populist religion that are hostile to political, social, and cultural difference. So that's what I'd say to that.
Thank you, Asran. Actually, I have stuff to say, and I'd like other speakers to also say something. But really, once again, just one more question from the audience before we move on. Okay, Salim Saab, you're a speaker now.
Good evening, everyone. Actually, I had a question that I wanted to probably to anyone in the panel who can maybe respond to that. The question pertains to the fact that Atif Mia has been probably was inducted into the Economic Advisory Committee when Imran Khan took over the government in 2018, and then dramatically he was maybe removed from that committee. So I just want to know as to why it happened, and probably he's a veteran in his own field, and he has earned a great name in the world of being a wonderful economist, and still he was not made a part of this mainstream policy making body in
Okay,
Pakistan.
Salim Saab, your voice is breaking up. We can't hear you.
Am I audible now? Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much. So I would want to repeat again. My question was regarding Professor Atif Mia as to why he was not,
Salim Saab, I'm sorry, we are not able to hear you. So I'm actually going to now turn to the speakers. We haven't heard from Zahid or Faisal for quite a while. Faisal, do you have any thoughts that you'd like to share at this moment?
Sure, yeah. Maybe just a couple of comments on subjects that have already been touched upon, specifically by Arsalan. One, the question of sovereignty. As I take it, Maududi and the Jamaat's position on sovereignty is very, very interesting because, of course, it seeks to expel sovereignty from the state. By attributing it to God, it removes it from the state. And this is what all three recensions of the Pakistani constitution more or less enable. And that is an interesting move because it suggests to me that even with a Deobandi-linked movement like the Jamaat, you have already the emergence of the social as the site of Islamic identification and indeed mobilization. Not accidental, because of course these movements come out of the colonial period, out of a period when no political mobilization was possible within the institutions of the state. They all had to occur outside the institutions of the state. So whether it is in India or Pakistan, the authenticity of mobilizations tends to this day to be anti-statist, even when it seeks to capture the state. So that's one part of the context. The other thing that, of course, is happening when you try to literally expel sovereignty by giving it over to God, by making it over to God, is that you then have to understand the state as being a non-sovereign institution, guided by the social, guided by society, and it's in society that religious leadership is based, not in the institutions of the state, according to Maududi's theory, as I understand it. Now, this way of thinking can go in two directions. It can go in a kind of anarchistic direction, and there is a long precedent for this that goes back to the Khilafat movement and even earlier, and it can go in a neoliberal direction, in the direction of branding and property and all these things that Noman, you and Arsalan have been speaking about. And Islamic movements can go in either direction, including Maududi himself and his Jamaat. What happens, though, with the Pakistani constitution, all three of its recensions, is that once you remove sovereignty from the institutions of the state and indeed from the constitution, then it comes back to haunt that constitution and the politics of the country as a ghost. And I have increasingly come to think that coups, both civilian or rather administrative coups, like the first coup in Pakistan, which was not a military coup, and the subsequent coups, which have been military coups, represent, as it were, the deferred and denied aspect of sovereignty that has ostensibly been rejected from the constitution itself. Once it is no longer present in the constitution, it comes back to haunt it in the form of the coup, military or not, which is the pure moment of sovereignty, a sovereignty that's not meant to exist, that is only meant to belong to God.
Oh, thank you. Faisal, are you done with your remark?
Yes, I think I shouldn't drag on.
Okay, excellent. Zahid, do you have anything on your mind at the moment? Okay, Zahid is not saying anything. So I have a question. So thank you for those very illuminating remarks, very suggestive remarks, both Arsalan and Faisal. But one of the things that strikes me, so I want to also, for the purposes of this program and the kind of mission that drives it, also once again want to turn to some of the more global dimensions of this relationship, because especially today we can see that we are in a general crisis, I'd say, and I'm not the only one, of the nation state. So many of the things that we're talking about, of course, the specific articulations, which you and we in the program have been emphasizing in Pakistan, the specific articulations are there, but then there are resonating phenomena that resemble the kinds of things that we're talking about, that one can see in all kinds of different countries and polities and national traditions. One of the things that strikes me, for instance, speaking of the global dimension, in the similarities between, speaking of sovereignty and nationalism, in the American tradition, the US tradition, the idea of manifest destiny, which actually resonates so much in Pakistan. There's even a book about Pakistan called Manifest Destiny of Pakistan. I have a book, with a 2,000-page book, which is Qawam-e Kainat, Ghazwa-e Hind, or Wujood-e Pakistan. In which, the idea is that there's some kind of actually cosmological, teleological, but once again, you can see that that's true also in the American tradition of nationalism. Yeah. And you can now see it also in the Indian tradition. It's become quite visible, both a global and almost a cosmological sort of mission that drives the nation or the nation state. Also similar, I think, between the Americans, or the Americans famously, part of the American national tradition is this idea of the city on a hill, also with the city on a hill being Jerusalem, which is why they also call themselves the New Jerusalem. Similarly, we have, as was so evident in Imran Khan's entire campaign, the idea of a new Medina, which is not new, which was present in the Pakistan movement itself. I'd like to open up some of the, because the reason I do this, I'm sure, is obvious. Yeah. So Pakistan gets taken as a particularly pathological phenomenon and unique unto itself, sui generis in some sense. So I'd like to open up that global dimension. Especially given the fact that the kinds of crises that we are seeing in Pakistan today are also crises that we are seeing in a number of other polities, some very, very prominent polities, some major countries in the world. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, if possible.
Go to Zahid.
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me?
DG, we can hear you, Zahid.
Acha. No, I would like to reply to one of the questions. It's like why Atif Mia was not actually was included in the Economic Council, and then later on he was dropped from that, and it was a very obvious reason, because of his faith. And I think probably the government is too weak to take any action, and it would have created a lot of problem for Imran Khan government. So this is what has changed in Pakistani society over the last few years. It's largely the growing intolerance, and also actually the blasphemy law, which has almost given a kind of a license to kill. And we have seen so many actually cases where people have taken law into their own hand. Salman Tasi's murder was one of the examples of that. And that basically is now increasing. And over the last few years, we have seen several such incidents. So I think probably that has also affecting the society. And that also, like when you talk about Imran Khan has given religiosity, kind of he's used religiosity increasingly for his populist appeal. And it's a very a very classical example where we see support base of Imran Khan. On the one hand, it's basically its support base comes from the middle class, educated section of the population, but there are also actually what we say a very conservative side of Imran Khan's politics, and it's a very dangerous. If you after Ziaullah, if any other government has used religiosity for political purposes, is basically was Imran Khan's government. And yes, actually, he talks about Madina ke Riyasat, which he has taken from the Islamic Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna from this movement in Egypt, and we have never heard actually any Islamic party using that term. Now, coming to other factors, I think probably, yes, when we talk about radicalization of religion, and also actually like it's a kind of reaction is also there from whatever happening across the world, and particularly Pakistani politics and religion. I think probably whatever happening in India, the rise of Hindu nationalism, Hindutva, is going to affect Pakistani politics also, and it will bring more radicalization here too. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Zahid Saab, for taking that question, as we weren't able to hear the question that was brought in by Salim. So I'll move to Dr. Faisal Devji now on Numan Naqvi Saab's question, where he compared like the global aspects of what's going on in America in terms of religion and politics, and how do you see all of that happening in Pakistan? So are there any parallels that we can draw, or what kind of a comparison this gives us when it comes to the global politics of religion and, of course, the politics?
Thank you, Ashad. I entirely agree with Noman that Pakistan is not an exception. If anything, it is ahead of the curve very often of what's going on globally. And the same can be said for India. Let us recall that Mr. Modi came to power with his particular brand of what today is called populist authoritarianism before Mr. Trump, and before many of the others who now share that unfortunate name. In Pakistan, you have similar precedent-setting events, whether they have to do with military takeovers and coups or with constitutionalism. And the case of that Zahid Saab mentioned of blasphemy and more generally of devotion to the Prophet that I had mentioned in my prefatory remarks is one of these instances where it is almost a kind of a politics of devotion and emotion that has taken center stage. You saw this very much the case in the Trump administration, where it is no longer questions about the law or indeed even the Constitution that are uppermost, but rather questions of popular feeling, therefore populism, and emotion and sentiment. And this was pioneered in Pakistan before it happened in the United States. And in Pakistan, it represents, I feel, the dismantling of what I referred to earlier, a kind of Deobandi dispensation, Deobandi way of thinking about these matters, so that we have come to rely almost entirely upon popular sentiment and emotion. I don't mean to suggest that this is about being irrational. Rather, what I would like to suggest is that this feeling of devotion, whether it is in India, of course, it's called bhakti, a word that is a traditional religious word that refers to devotion to deities, but that has become a political word because it compares the devotion given to people like Mr. Modi and others in the BJP to the devotion given to deities in traditional Hinduism. You see, of course, similar thing happening in Pakistan, not always a devotion extended to a person, though Mr. Imran Khan seems to possess that in full measure, and he possesses it in an interesting way. He himself has made the comparison with Bhutto, Zede Bhutto. Though, of course, they differ in almost every other respect, he is correct in this respect, at least, that Bhutto certainly did set the precedent for populist leadership that Imran Khan has taken up. So it's the element of bhakti or devotion that really is what the two of them share, and that is also shared by new religious mobilizations and movements, which, as I said, are no longer about constitutional fixes, but about things like breaking links with France because of blasphemy allegations or Islamophobia. So I think this really bears consideration, and it does so, I think, because I suspect that the politics of feeling is about a displacement, or it signals filling in, as it were, a void where theology once stood. We tend to think of the presence of religion in public life as being the presence of theology in public life. But I think exactly the opposite is true. The politics of emotion is about the absence of the theological, which it tries to reconstitute in an ersatz way. And that's why the emotion has to be so deeply felt and often break forth in violence.
Thank you, Faisal, for those very insightful remarks. It does occur to me, I mean, the transformations that nationalism have undergone. That's a very general remark, but nationalism itself has undergone over a long period of time that we forget some moments in its trajectory. So, in terms of the relationship between emotion and nationalism, I was thinking of Marcus Dexel's book, for instance, The Politics of Self-Expression, the Urdu middle class milieu from the 1930s to the 1950s, where he charts this expressive politics, which is all about emotion and identity, in the constitutive moment of several nationalisms in our region, different faces of nationalism in our region, both Muslim nationalism, Hindu nationalism, etc. And also in terms of America, I remember one historian said that you could write the entire history of the United States as a history of great awakenings. And we've spent actually, if we think about the Republican Party, we've been going through some kind of great awakening for the past 40 years or so in American politics. But your remarks, of course, are right on the as to use the American expression. I mean, in India, of course, Modi is often represented in the popular sphere as an avatar of Vishnu. I've seen remarkable material on Facebook and other social media that represents him like that to bring out the bhakti element. And Jesus, and Trump, of course, represented as the muscular Jesus on the cross, or the hand of God, as many evangelicals think of him. It's really a remarkable moment. But isn't it the case? So my question then, is it the case that nationalism, so maybe there's a tension here between nationalism and citizenship, or citizenship seems to demand a more deliberative ethos, whereas nationalism, of course, you can't have citizenship without nationalism, given the fact that we live in an order of nation states. Isn't it the case that this tension exists everywhere in terms of a deliberative and an emotive dimension?
Yeah, thanks, Noman. Yeah, I think you're quite right. And, just to link what you just said with a question that had come up previously about the Wahhabis and Saudi Arabia, what you see happening in Saudi Arabia today is very interesting. The complete decimation and implosion of the establishment. It's finished. It's gone. It's not that it's been replaced by anything better. It's been replaced by its crown prince, its MBS, as he's popularly known, who has done what? Who has tried to replace the Wahhabi establishment with a new kind of Saudi nationalism. There was never such thing as Saudi nationalism in the past. After all, it's an absolute monarchy. Now you have to have some degree of nationalism, and all emotion has to be channeled through it, and through it to the future king of the country. But what I find interesting about this new nationalism is how dated it is. It is basically a revival of the kind of modernization theory, authoritarian modernization theory represented by the Ataturk Mustafa Kemal Pasha in the 1920s and by Reza Shah also in the 20s and 30s, and by Ayub Khan in the 1950s in Pakistan. So it's a way of thinking about politics in a way. It's a way of thinking about politics that's already dead. Interestingly, it suggests to me that whether it's Saudi Arabia or the UAE, and indeed some other Gulf countries, the destruction of the religious establishment can be followed up by nothing more than the reinstating of an already dead form of doing politics, because of course there's nothing genuine about it. It may not call itself secular, but in fact it mirrors all the defects of the old form of political modernization. So what we are not in fact seeing the revival. We tend to think about religion in terms of revival. As you said, Noman, in America we have periodic revivals. The religion hasn't gone away, but I wouldn't say it is enjoying a revival either. On the contrary, we are seeing the opposite. We are seeing the kind of smashing of religious establishments. And in a country like Pakistan, that is being done by populist religious movements themselves. On the one hand, as several speakers have said already, the Deobandi establishment, which had been so powerful, seems to be on the back foot. And on the other hand, you have the rise of the TLP, which is hardly a party of ulama. There's something else going on here that really merits consideration.
I think, Noman, can
Ji, Zahid Saab, you want to add something up?
Yeah, I think this changes and development in Saudi Arabia is very, very significant, and I think it will going to have a very significant impact in other countries, Muslim countries too, because it was not just that the Wahhabism was one of the pillars of the Saudi monarchy, but Saudis have also been exporting Wahhabism. And the rise of militant Islam or even actually Wahhabi Islam in Pakistan is also largely owed to Saudi support in a way, way back in 1980s and even later on. Lots of madrasas, the radical madrasas, had been financed by the Saudi money. So I think this change in not only Saudi Arabia but in the Gulf countries will have a quite significant impact here too. But one thing more about Pakistan, one could say that it's when we talk about Barelvi assertion, which is quite, I think probably is going to be much more dangerous. Like for example, when we talk about comparing TTP and TLP. TTP is a militant organization. It wanted to enforce its own version of Sharia system through force, and in fact, actually control territory. But TLP is different. It is not aspiring to control territory, but its influence is much deeply rooted in society. And in fact, actually, what we are witnessing today is that increasing intolerance and rise of this militancy in the name of or using blasphemy as a weapon. It has increased. So it, in a way, actually, for society, I think this rise of Brelvi Islam, or in the shape of TLP, is going to have a much more deeper and effect on the society.
Can I also speak to that a little?
Yes, Arslan, you can.
Yes, I think that what Faisal Deji Saab said is very, very interesting and insightful about this sort of new politics of affect. One thing I would just add is that if you look at blasphemy politics, right, the affect still crystallizes, if you will, around the law, right, around the blasphemy laws, which have taken on this affective force. So in both the case of something like, some very different, but something like PTI or TLP, right, they both draw on this sort of affect, but they have a vision of a moral sovereign, right, a moral law and a person that sort of represents the law against, all the powers that are in the middle of that sovereignty in a way, right? Corruption, people, right? All the politics that's impure. So there's this desire to return to a purity, but it has some element of the thing about it is it's not bereft of the state, right? It is the sacralization of the state and the transcendent principle that is the state that is so central. So if you go, misal ke taur pe agar aap blasphemy, matlab, you go to these the rallies, you immediately get from both the Brailvis and the Deobandis. So maybe others who do research on this can speak to whether Brailvis are doing this as well. But you always get the invocation of the Islamic law as शरीयत, right? कि पाकिस्तान के जो कवानीन हैं blasphemy के वो शरई हैं, मतलब they are the शरीयत, and it is necessary, and there's no change, you can't change them, they exist, and so there's a collapsing of the state of Pakistan, that is the Pakistani state, and the original Islam, right? And so there's a sense so I think all I'm trying to say is that the affective force of the movements are linked to a kind of idea of the state and the pure state that is often crystallizes around the law. So in the same way that PTI will say, oh, ye sab chor hain, ye sab, like they're all corrupt, they're in violation of some transcendent principle of the state. So, I mean, that's not contradicting anything Faisal Saab said, but I'm just saying that like that effort to connect the effect of the people to the state sovereign, particularly through the law. That's, I think, a key feature of this.
Thank you so much, Arslan, and everyone else for the remarks. अब हम कुछ सवालात की तरफ से जाएंगे और audience request भेज सकते हैं. Our colleague Rida will make you a speaker and then हम आपका सवाल ले सकते हैं और आप सवाल उर्दू में भी पूछ सकते हैं और हम कोशिश करेंगे कि अगर कोई उर्दू में सवाल है तो उसका जवाब भी अपने पैनलिस्ट से ले लें. So is there any question? अगर हैं तो रिदा प्लीज आप स्पीकर बना दें ताकि हम क्वेश्चन ले सकें. रिदा की आवाज नहीं आ रही लेकिन जरताशा साहिबा, I guess if I'm correctly pronouncing your name, you can ask your question.
Actually, there are a few things I really wanted to contribute in this discussion. It's a very informative discussion, although the title is for the religion and the politics in Pakistan, but we also heard about the international perspective as well. I heard the speakers that they are speaking about the different like the religious relation with the politics, like how different leaders basically using this religious perspective to sell their populist remarks and to sell their populist in the Pakistan.
No, unfortunately, we can't hear you now.
I can hear them.
You can hear her?
Yes, I can hear them.
Zertasha, you can ask your question. I mean, we can't hear, but if the speaker other speakers can hear, आप पूछ सकते हैं.
Okay.
Now it's gone.
Zertasha, you are mute. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
No, I don't think it's working, and we're running out of time, unfortunately. Actually, I think it's given the fact that the program is supposed to end at 10:30, we'll go over a few minutes, but not much more. So I think it's time to start wrapping up and closing the discussion. If the speakers would like to make some closing remarks, I think we should give them some time to do that. Faisal, do you have some closing remarks?
Yeah, I'd just like to say something on the question of blasphemy. It's an interesting word. Of course, it's a word that comes out of Christianity, and yet we use it all the time, and we don't use, as it were, properly Islamic theological words, even in most, as I take it, even in most popular descriptions of what is going on in the Pakistani media, for instance. We use, again, affective words, insult, offense, which don't have any theological specificity, but can be used of ordinary people as well. And you know what they are. I don't need to spell out those words for you. And I think that's very interesting because what it suggests to me is that the theological element actually has to be brought in. It's not like it doesn't exist in the Islamic tradition, but it nevertheless has to be brought in from Christianity in particular, and specifically from the West. So you will recall the first global instance of controversy over blasphemy was the Rushdie affair in 1989. And there, of course, the reference was to at that time, the British blasphemy law. Subsequently, Prime Minister of Pakistan has campaigned to have Pakistani law, to have the Irish blasphemy law become a model for a global law applied to blasphemy against the Prophet. In all of these ways, what we're seeing is what Noman was suggesting in one of his comments earlier, the globalization of of Islamic language, except the globalization is accomplished through the language of Christianity and through Christian theology, not through Islamic theology. This is not to lay any blame on Christian theology, which has been misused in this respect. It is to show that there's no there when we talk about Islamic theology. It is that very theology that is evanescent and disappearing to be replaced by the kinds of things we have been speaking about today.
Thank you, Faisal, for those closing remarks. Arsalan, would you like to say something in closing?
I mean, I think this is a wonderful conversation. Thank you for all the questions. I think we started with the discussion of religion and politics, and even though I think my comments were focused on Islam and the state, and Islamic sovereignty, but religious politics, of course, is much broader than just the politics of capturing or trying to capture the state. तो अगर आप मतलब मेरे अपने काम में जो तबलीगी जमात पे काम है उसमें देखते हैं ना तो a lot of religious movements in Pakistan, of course, are not invested in that same kind of state politics. So I'll just say as a caveat, many of my comments are directed at groups that are either in the democratic arena or even non-democratic, trying to, in a sense, capture state power and state sovereignty. And that we, as a field, though, the relationship of religion and politics is in Pakistan far more, I think, complicated with many interesting different theological and social possibilities. That's what I'll say.
Thank you very much. I think this is one of the takeaways from our discussion is the transformation of religion and the varieties of the relationship between religion and politics. But now allow me to ask Zahid to make his closing remarks. Zahid, do you have some closing remarks for us?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that capturing of a state, sometimes we just see the impact of religious organization or their power. It's likely it is true that religious party has never been able to have significant number of seats in the parliament. They have not been able to, like TLP, the rise of TLP has been talked a lot about. But in the previous election, they could not win a single seat in the National Assembly. But saying all that, their power is much greater than their electoral support, or the representation in the parliament, because their militancy has forced other political parties, even the more moderate ones actually, to follow their agenda. And that's what we have seen in Pakistani politics, that overall politics have become to hostage to this kind of organization, particularly what we have seen, the TLP, that over the last 2 years, we have seen they had come out on the street and they were able to bend the state to their demand. And that is their much more scary and much more actually dangerous trend, where the state is completely become kind of a hostage to this kind of militant or more radical Islamic groups.
Thank you, Zahid. I think there's a lot of resonance with the remarks that all of our panelists have been making, and resonates with so much that's going on in other parts of the world. The word populism has been used several times here. Indeed, the development of fascism. I would like our speakers to reflect on the fact that, in fact, what our panelists have been pointing to is the dramatic transformation and variability of this very category of religion. As Faisal has been emphasizing, what we might be seeing might not be religion in any traditional conventional sense of the term at all. In fact, it's a destruction of the theological element, and it's overwhelming transformation by nationalism and populism. With those brief remarks, I'd like to thank all of the panelists. Thank you so much. This was a really stimulating session. I'd also like to thank all of the audience members for their questions as well as their presence here. And hopefully we'll see you next Saturday as well, when our conversation will inshallah be about history. So as I said earlier, we're going to go through these 4 different lenses, starting this session itself on the religious dimension of the political crisis in Pakistan, and not just Pakistan, obviously. And then after that, we'll go to history, inshallah, next Saturday. And after that, literature and then philosophy. All right, thank you very much. Khuda Hafiz to everyone.